Hi there, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing with you some of my English folk magic beginner book recommendations. So over the past 2 years I've really dived deep into my English folk magic practice and I'm learning every day and it feels amazing. People seem to really enjoy my English folk magic protection charms video, so I figured I would share with you some books that will help you understand what it means to practice English folk magic. I did actually recommend some books in that prior video, but in this video, these books I'm going to share with you today are framed for the beginner witch. A lot of the juicy English folk witchcraft books, which you can probably see behind me, tend to be quite dry and historical and very hard to read if you're a beginner to the craft and you're not used to reading that type of material. So I figured I would make this video focusing on books which are very easy to digest relatively and still include really great information. But I will be doing a video on more advanced English folk magic books a bit later on. So I should add that all 5 of these books have really great bibliography sections. This is something I forgot to say in my Books for Beginner Witches video. Each of these books have really great bibliography sections. I think the formatting is great. The general structure of each book I think is really lovely, and that's something just to say because they apply to all the books. I didn't want to say it individually throughout the video. So that's something to consider. Always check your bibliography sections in your books if you want to dive deep into the content of that book, if you're really enjoying it. And yeah, just go deep into your research in that way. So without further ado, the first book I want to recommend to you is The Book of English Magic by Philip Carr-Gomm and Richard Heygate. So this book is a bit more of a recent read, which I know is dangerous because of recency bias, but I do recommend it because I think this whole book is formatted in such a beginner, layperson friendly way that the information is so easy to absorb and there's so much history in here. It's a really good book. This book touches on an array of different types of magic, so not just folk magic, so what you'd think of like cunning folk, but also they touch on the history and development of Wicca. They touch on druidry, astrology, ceremonial-based traditions such as Rosicrucians, if I'm pronouncing that right, or Freemasonry, Arthurian stuff, but they also go quite deep into, you know, the cunning craft, toadmen, weirdcraft, wart cunning, all that type of sort of rural folk magic practices which you'd expect to see in English folk magic, they touch on here. And they explain it in a format which is really accessible, really easy to understand. Throughout this book there are autobiography sections, so they've clearly gotten people in to give a little information about a specific topic they touch on in each chapter. And these sections are formatted in really grey writing. You can kind of see it here. So this is actually a little bit hard to read. So if you have any sight difficulties, then this actually might be quite inaccessible for you. I think that's something to consider. I don't know why they went with this really light grey font. I can read it fine, and you know, and that's fine, and most people might be able to read it fine. But I just wanted to say, just in case that does put anyone off, because I do think it's quite weird they've done it in such a light grey font. Yeah, so that's something to consider. Perhaps if you got it on as an ebook, then they wouldn't have that issue. But I wanted to say that that could be inaccessible for some people, and yeah. Anyway, but why I'm recommending this book, because the way they go over the history of magic within England throughout the ages is so easy to understand. Sometimes reading history books, like I love Ronald Hutton, but and he knows his stuff and it's great reads, but they are quite slow reads. It takes me a while to go through them because it's quite dense and quite dry. No shade, Ronald Hutton, love you. But I think this book really formats, you know, key history of English magic in a way which actually is quite a quick read, despite it being such a big book. So yeah, that's why I recommend this book. And I think having an overall background of magic in England helps you understand contextually what English folk magic was like and what these people practiced in context to what was also around them and developing after and before. So I think that's why I think a book like this is really good. Another thing that I really liked what they did is at the end of each chapter, obviously each chapter focusing on a specific topic of magic, at the end they give resources for each section, for each chapter, which is always amazing when books do that. But they also give like a things to do section, so they give bullet point lists of things you can do around England specific to this type of magic they're talking about. So one example here I'll give is they talk about spellcraft and skin turning and things to do here, and they have a section saying to visit the Museum of Witchcraft at Boscastle in Cornwall, and they give a whole bunch of different stuff. And I just think that's such a nice interactive thing to add. Of course, if you're not living in England and you don't visit regularly, then this might be a bit like, oh well, what's the point? So this might not be very interesting to you, but obviously anyone who is really keen about this stuff, you can sort of get an idea of actually where in England you can visit and sort of see this history of English magic. So I think that's such a cool thing to add in a book like this. So yeah, that is my first recommendation. The second book I'm going to recommend to you is The British Book of Spells and Charms by Graham King. This is a really, really sweet, good book on what spellcraft, spellworking looks like in English folk magic. And I guess more broadly, British folk magic there's charms from Scotland and from Wales in here, so that's something to consider also. It's not just England. But I do think this book is really good as a read, because I think the way he formats these spells is that he's the former owner of that museum in Boscastle, Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, which is amazing, by the way. If you're ever in Cornwall, go visit that museum. Oh, they also have a website online. You can look at their collection, which I spoke about in my Protection Charms video, so I'll put the link again down below in the description. Great museum, love it. But in this book, he has, for example, records of spells and charms and pictures that are in the museum. So it's kind of nice to see that as well. But what I really liked about how he formatted this book is that each chapter kind of goes over a specific type of magic. So removing curses and cursing, or spells and charms, divinations for love, good luck charms, protection charms. And the way he talks about these charms is he doesn't just list what they are, but he goes over how the magic could have possibly worked. So he'll talk about, for example, sympathetic magic and what it meant to perform this charm and what the aim was to actually do it. It's also really heavily referenced, so if you were only focused on reading like English folk magic charms, you can see in the annotated citations what he's referenced and where he's gotten the charms from, so you can kind of do that further research and see more specifically where these charms came from. So that's why I really like this book. I guess one thing to say is that it's a Troy Books release, and Troy Books are amazing, by the way. However, they tend to be a bit harder to find, so my suggestion to you is scour the internet. If you're ever in London, near London, go to the occult bookshops there. So there's Treadwell's, there's Atlantis bookshops, and there's Watkins. They're both three famous occult bookshops, and they have an array of different occult selections, both rare and common. I recommend going to those shops to find them. Also, you can order from the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic if you're in the UK. Maybe they do international shipping, but I don't know. It's not sponsored or anything, also, by the way. But if you order from there, they usually have Troy Books stock online in their shop, just as a helpful hint. I find if you just look for your local witchy, occult, metaphysical store and look at their book section, you'd be surprised. Sometimes they have stock of Troy Books, and you can find them online, but they're much harder to find in places like Amazon for some reason. So just letting you know, you can find them, but they tend to be a little bit harder to find. But if you can find it, it's such a good book, it's really valuable. Yeah, so overall, I think it's a really easy to digest book. It's not a very long read. It won't take you very long to read it. Quite fast paced, and it's all based on historical records of spells. So obviously there's some in here which you probably won't recreate, if not most of them, but it's understanding that baseline theory which helps you actually put that into practice in your modern witchcraft practice. So I think a book like this is really valuable in helping you understand spell work in English folk magic. The third recommendation is The Black Toad by Gemma. Now again, this is a Troy Books release, so all of the prior advice applies here. Also, something I forgot to say, you can just order straight from Troy Books on their online website if all else fails, so just as that as a helpful hint in order to get these books. But Troy Books are really valuable. There's quite a few that I wanted to include in this list, but I didn't want to keep repeating the same publisher, so I would thoroughly recommend looking into getting some Troy Books if you are interested in English folk magic, because they have a lot of really interesting releases on specifically regional practices in English folk magic. So just thought I'd say that. But this book is The Black Toad, and this goes over West Country witchcraft and magic. So West Country refers to essentially the area of England which is Cornwall and Devonshire. Perhaps this focuses more on Devonshire, but Gemma is quite a famous author for traditional witchcraft. You may recognise this book that she's done, it's quite popular, which is a good book, but I specifically chose this one because her prior books on traditional witchcraft, such as this one and this one, they tend to be a bit more focused on her tradition of witchcraft, which is essentially folk ceremonial craft which is rooted and based on folklore in Cornwall, whereas this one I feel like focuses more on the folk magic that is existing in Devon. So this book is quite short, sweet, there's lovely illustrations. I mean, this cover is gorgeous, and I think she does the illustrations all herself as well, and they are absolutely beautiful. It's gorgeous. So the format of the book is really lovely. Her writing style is really poetic as well, and I think that this book has so many lovely ideas for folk magic, English folk magic practice in your craft. It's very sort of modernised in that sense, whereas this tends to be just a list of historical records and you kind of have to apply that information to modern craft and spell work, whereas this one I think formats more in a already modernised craft perspective, if that makes sense, but it's still rooted in this folklore and this folk magic. I think it's just a great book, because if you think about it, a lot of English folk magic charms tend to be a little bit gruesome, and actually she has included pictures in here of such, which I won't show, but so they tend to be quite gruesome and things which I guess the modern witch wouldn't necessarily jump to practicing immediately or if ever, which is valid, but I think she kind of like talks about charms and stuff and what to do in a way which is actually pretty accessible and quite nice to do. But yeah, I really recommend this book. It's really sweet. There's a lot about sort of wart cunning and herb craft in here as well, as that's quite essential to sort of cunning craft, cunning folk practices. And I think you'll get lots of really lovely ideas for this. So yeah, I recommend this book. The next book I'm going to recommend is East Anglian Witches and Wizards by Michael Howard. Now this is a 3 Hands Press release. I think this is fairly accessible online to find. Last I checked it was quite easy to find on Amazon. But Michael Howard, who did the foreword for this book, just to say, but this book I think is maybe a slightly more challenging read. I wanted to include at least one challenging read on here because I love this book. I think this book is great. It's densely packed with information, historical records, but with that I guess comes a little bit of dry writing. I think that at times it's a bit more of a slow read essentially. I think this may take you a bit longer to go through because of the dry writing style. Sorry, but I do think that it is good. It's a good book. So he touches on a lot on the witch trials in East Anglia, which the region is sort of known for. If you're not aware, East Anglia is a region within England, to the sort of east of the country, but it's notorious for its witch trials, and he goes into depth in here, where he talks about historical records, and sometimes it can kind of drag on a little bit in this book, but there's so much information here that there's so much you can get out from it. So he talks a lot about Matthew Hopkins in here, the witch finder general. He talks a lot about familiars in here as well. He talks about just general cunning folk practices and specific folk magic, which is localized to East Anglia as a region. So you'll see, for example, toad magic, toad bone stuff, horse and hare magic. And he also discusses, he has a section dedicated to notable cunning folk characters, like people that existed within the region of East Anglia, which I think is quite cool. So it is a history book essentially, but it does sort of appeal to the modern practitioner. So I think it's nice in that sense as a book to recommend to beginners. I think if you're slightly younger and you're not used to reading history, academic books, I think you'll probably find this a bit harder to read. But if you're up for a challenge, I say go for it. I don't think it's too hard to read. I just think there's quite a lot of information in here. So you might feel a little bit overwhelmed, but it is a good book, and I do recommend it. And my last book, my fifth and last book I'm going to recommend is Botanical Folktales of Britain and Ireland by Lisa Schneidau? Schneidau? I'm really sorry. But yeah, I'm recommending this because this might be a slightly unconventional one to recommend. You wouldn't really, I guess, think to include it in an English folk book list. Maybe not, maybe I'm just making that up. But I do think that it is a useful book. I love this book, and obviously disclaimer that this book is not just focused on England, it's Britain and Ireland, so that's something to consider. But there is quite a lot of English stories in here, so that's why I have included it. So I'm including a plant folktales book because I think folk magic is something which is fluid and it's multi-dimensional, and I think especially when we're getting into modern witchcraft practices and pulling from folklore, we pull from these folk magic sources in order to build this, you know, modernized perspective of being a folk witch, for example. And I think that books like these, when you're looking at folk tales, they tell stories about how people had relationships to, you know, for example, these flowers. And I think understanding that and reading these stories helps you get a perspective that people had in relation with these plants, how people viewed these plants, relationships they had with them, overarching symbolism that you can sort of see and pull from the message of these stories. Also, I just think that this book is so sweet and the stories are so lovely, and I listened to the audiobook of this, and that was really lovely actually. So if you prefer audiobooks, I would actually recommend getting this audiobook form, but I bought a physical copy because I enjoyed the story so much. Obviously, herbal magic is something which is quite present within not just folk magic, but witchcraft in general. So I think definitely a way you can improve and enrich your herbal magic is looking at plant folklore. And, you know, these magical encyclopedias, I've spoken about this on my channel before, magical encyclopedias like Cunningham's Herbs, you know, it's a great book. Those books that have like herbal encyclopedias, they're great and really useful for your practice. But I also think that in order to deepen and enrich your herbal magic, you could go a bit further into looking at folk magic sources. So hence why I'm recommending this one. Obviously, as I've said, each book has a bibliography section and they're amazing. But what I specifically want to point out in this book is that this back section has where this author got the sources from, got the tales from. So that's something to consider. So if you wanted to do a bit more digging and read the like original sort of text where they got the tale from, you can do that, and that actually is really helpful. So yeah, those are my 5 recommendations for you. I have a whole bunch of other books I do recommend, but I wanted to do 5 just to keep it simple for now, and I'll definitely do a more advanced English folk magic book recommendations video because I think that is also really useful, but I wanted to at least give some books which I think are easy to digest for a beginner, for someone who's sort of just stepping into what English folk magic practice is, English folk witchcraft in general, just to sort of get an understanding of, okay, what actually is it. And I think these books will help you sort of get a basic idea, and you can then go further. So I have some exciting news before I end the video. I have a Patreon now. It's now been nearly a year since I started this channel, and I have just immensely appreciated the support you guys have given me on this channel. I think we're close to 5,000 subscribers now, which just blows my mind. And I don't want to get all soppy because I know it can be annoying, but I really appreciate it. And if there's anyone who wants to support me a little bit further, you can now do so with Patreon. You can look at the different tiers and you can find more details below by clicking the link if you are interested in that. But yeah, I just really appreciate it. I want to say that my videos will always be here and they'll always be free for you to watch on YouTube, as well as my Discord community. That's still free and that's still available for anyone to join. However, because I just wanted to give a little bit back to people who do want to support me further on Patreon, I will be making some exclusive content on there. At the moment, for the 3rd tier, I'm planning on giving anyone who decides to support me on the 3rd tier exclusive book review videos. I'll always be sharing with you my book recommendations videos as I'm doing today here, but I think I'm going to be making videos specifically book review style and uploading them there, and I think that's what I'm going to be doing. So if you're interested in that, of course go look at it, and I greatly appreciate it so much. But yeah, yay, exciting. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you've read any of these books before, tell me below, and what did you think of them? And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.